One of the cool things about writing a book is you get to see your experience through other people's eyes, and they often notice things that you hadn't noticed.
Welcome to Heart with Anna. I am Anna Jaworski and your host, also a heart mom to an adult who was born with a single ventricle heart and who is 29 years old. It's the reason why I am the host of your program. Today, I have James Robinson with me. James is married to his wife, Tali, and is the father of three sons, Gilad, Yaniv, and Nadav. In 2017, his article, Road to Recovery, was featured on the front page of the Times Sunday Travel section, describing a road trip his family took after the death of his 5-year-old son, Nadav. The piece was translated into 2 languages, receiving scores of appreciative comment, and was selected as a notable essay in the Best American Travel Writing for 2018. The overwhelming response to the article inspired James to write his book, More Than We Expected: 5 Years with a Remarkable Child, detailing the many gifts of his son's brief but remarkable life and finding strength in the most unexpected places. So, welcome to Heart with Anna, James.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's great to be here.
Well, I so enjoyed reading your book. It touched me in so many ways. And I wasn't expecting it to because my child is going to be 30, but your book was really touching. So, probably a lot of my listeners haven't read your book yet. So, let's start from the top and have you tell us about Nadav's congenital heart condition.
Yep, Nadav was diagnosed in utero with a significant congenital heart defect, single ventricle heterotaxy, which we found out later was a function of primary ciliary dyskinesia. We did not know that at the time. But I'm sure a lot of your listeners are very savvy about heart conditions. Just in case they aren't, it basically means that the heart is born with a single ventricle, not 2 as we normally have, and that requires 3 surgeries, which are palliative. And the goal is to get him to teenage years where he would be a better candidate for a heart transplant.
Right. Like your son, my child was also diagnosed with a single ventricle condition, not heterotaxy, but hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And then later they changed it to single ventricle. And my child has had 3 surgeries, and they told us that transplant might be an option, but it seems like in your case, they were certain it was going to be a potentiality.
It was potentially possible, but I mean, there were no guarantees in anything in our journey. As you know, the heart surgeries themselves, they're all incredibly complicated. We actually ended up having 4 surgeries, one of them unexpected. So I don't think there's an easy path through this for any of us. And that was one of the reasons I called the book More Than We Expected, because things ended up going sideways in pretty spectacular ways.
Right. And with heterotaxy, it's even more complicated in some ways than what my child was born with because some of the other organs can be on the other side of the body. Isn't that true?
That's right. Yeah. So Nadav's organs were all a little off. His lungs chambers were not the same as ours. I think he had 2 left or 2 right. And one of the things that is amazing when you come face to face with a condition like this is you realize how incredible the body is and how magical it is. Anything happens at all, and you end up learning a lot about anatomy.
Yes.
Unfortunately, so I know a lot about lungs. I know his intestines were at a greater risk of twisting into what they call a volvulus, which I resolved never to think about because it was terrifying.
Yeah.
He was a splenic, which also was very difficult because it meant that he was more susceptible to infection. So from birth, he was on a prophylactic course of amoxicillin. And when we met with the infectious diseases guy, we said, what precautions do we have to take? And he said, just treat him like your son. You can't keep him in a bubble. And we really took that advice to heart. And in fact, being a splenic sort of granted us a certain special VIP status in the pediatrician's office because you didn't have to wait with everybody else. You just whisper that he was a splenic and they whisk you right into your own private room. And I think that's one of the interesting things that I didn't expect when we were thrust into this journey was that although there's a fair amount of terror when you're in this situation, you also feel a great deal of pride in your child, both of resilience and how special kids are, but also in yourself as you pick up all this medical knowledge, all these medical skills, all these
Right.
things that you have to know, and all these hoops you have to jump through, and not to be too sad about it when your child dies. That's a very difficult thing to cope with because not only have you lost your child, but you've lost that part of your own identity. Suddenly, all those things are rendered irrelevant
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
useless. So
Yeah. Dealing with a child with a chronic illness, especially a congenital heart defect, does become a significant part of your identity and your routine. Things are very different. You're saying that your son was splenic. And for those of my listeners who don't know what that means he was born without a spleen. And a spleen is really critical to combating illnesses and germs. So the fact that he didn't have that organ to help him meant that he was at more risk for infections. And that's why he was a top priority patient when he would go to the hospital. So, yeah, I learned a lot about that by reading your book because my child does have a spleen. And I had no idea how critical that was. I do know that as adults, sometimes people lose their spleens. I live in Texas where football is king. And it's not uncommon, sadly, for kids to have accidents on the football field. And sometimes it deals with the spleen. And I've actually heard of people who have had to have their spleen removed because of football accidents. So I knew that you could live without one. I didn't realize how critical it was as an infant to have one.
It's important, but it was the least of our worries. We learned to prioritize things in a really weird way. I remember in his first surgery, which was a BTT shunt, he came out and his left lung was collapsed. And for most parents, even certainly my parents, when they heard the news, they were completely freaked out. It was terrifying for them. But we knew that was the score, and we knew that that was something to expect. And we knew it wasn't such a big deal in the grand scheme of things. So it does kind of reorient how you prioritize all these things.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not uncommon for kids who undergo open heart surgery, especially a lengthy open heart surgery. And I know for us, our BTT shot was 8 hours.
Mm.
That's a long surgery. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon for that lung to collapse. And you're just waiting on pins and needles to see if it will reinflate and how things will go and dealing with the pleural effusions in the meantime. And learn more about that later. But right now, what really fascinated me was when I was reading your book and you were talking about embryonic cilia. This was something I had never heard of, the magical path of proteins. So I'm sure since it's new to me, it's probably new to a lot of my listeners as well. Tell me how you learned about this and what all that means for those of us in the heart world.
Like I said, having being in this situation puts you face to face with the things that you don't know and will never understand.
Right.
And some of those things are incredibly terrifying. Like the thought that your son's body is malformed and you may outlive him is terrifying. And not to know when that might be a possibility or when it might happen is horrible. But it does open your eyes to these wonders that you don't ordinarily realize. When our first son was born, you walk out of the hospital and you're on cloud nine because you're face to face with the miracle of life,
Exactly.
right? But when something goes wrong, it makes it even more astounding that anything ever goes right.
Yes.
And that is a real privilege, I think, to have that. It sounds very strange to say, or strange for other people to hear, I think. But for me, it was certainly true. And one of the things that it taught me was how the body forms, because I was quite curious about what might have caused this condition. Nobody ever really said anything about any of this. I had to go research it on my own, and I found it in the New York Times science section. There was an article, I think a year after he was born, about how the body forms in the first few weeks after conception. When the embryo is incredibly small, it's
Mhm.
perfectly symmetrical, and how that perfectly symmetrical little tiny thing actually knows how to grow into a human being. And it turns out that on the surface of the embryo, there are these little hairs called cilia. 10th grade biology, you might look on microscopes, right? And you see amoebas and paramecium, right? And you see them sort of swimming around and they're beating their little hairs to move around. Those are cilia. And the embryo has that too. And what the function of the cilia in the embryo is that it beats the amniotic fluid around the embryo in a certain way, right? So there's like a little swirl. And the direction of the swirl dictates how the proteins in your body are laid out that will eventually form your organs. So the path of the amniotic fluid, which is beat by the cilia, moves around and that lays out the proteins which then form the organs. If they're beating the opposite way, the wrong way, so to speak, your organs will form in a complete mirror image. And that's something called situs inversus. And I think one in every 10,000 people has it. Most people don't even know it because you have no reason to know it. Your organs are a complete mirror image of what they should normally be. They're perfectly functional, they're just back to front. But in extraordinarily rare cases, the cilia, if they don't beat properly, the proteins don't follow the right map and they don't follow the right path. And that leads to defects like what happened with our son with heterotaxy. And it affected all the other organs, as you mentioned. It also affected his heart. And it was because the cilia were not beating properly. Now, the most crazy thing about this to me when I read about it was this whole process happens in about 3 hours. So, in enough time for dinner and a movie, the path of your organs is dictated and formed. And obviously, this may have happened even before we knew we were pregnant, but there was something about the malformed cilia that had dictated all these things, and I found that incredibly mind-blowing.
So, and what's amazing is he has a twin, and
He
the
has
twin did not have that condition, and the twin's heart is perfectly fine.
yes, yes. They're not identical twins. They're about as different as twins can be, actually, which is great. I mean, I think
Yeah,
that's great. But
yeah.
you're right. I mean, how does fate dictate that this happens to one and not the other?
I don't know.
Was
That's
just really kind
amazing.
of yeah.
Wow. But you took it a step further, and you learned out that you have a mutation, a genetic mutation in the H5 gene. Okay, so
You're
now
giving away the end of the book. Your listeners have to promise to buy the book now.
I know,
I'm gonna give
right?
away one of the best parts of the book.
It's just amazing. I'm sorry for giving it away. Friends, you have to buy the book because this is just amazing. When I got to that point, I thought, wow, I remember being so angry when I asked the doctor what caused my child's heart condition. And my doctor said, oh, it's a fluke of nature. That was so not satisfying, James. And I thought, no, it's not. You may not know the answer. This was not a fluke of nature. This is happening to way too many people for this to just be a fluke of nature. So you took it a step further. You got genetic testing. And what amazed me was how everyone except for his twin also has this condition.
Okay, so let me tell the mind-blowing secret 3/4 of the way through the book is gonna give it away, but that's okay. But I enjoy your podcast, and I wanna keep your listeners happy. Here's the incredible truth behind his condition. When he was born, it didn't really matter to me, at least, why his body had formed the way it is. We had this reality, we had to deal with it. And what had caused it was kind of academic. I sort of assumed it was a random mutation, not necessarily genetic, but I didn't really know because we were so practical in terms of figuring out what's wrong.
Sure.
Years later, when he was discharged from a long hospital stay, he was seen by a genetic counselor who was doing a study on kids with heterotaxy. And they asked if we would mind doing genetic testing for this study that they were doing. So they took his blood and they took my blood and they took Talia's blood. It was actually kind of a funny moment in the hospital because I went with Nadav and he was like a pincushion and I had to get my blood run and I was not happy about it. He was a very wise soul. He gave me this look at 5 years old. And Dad, like, get over it. We got the results back, and it turns out that, as you mentioned, this primary ciliary dyskinesia can be caused by many genetic mutations, but ours was caused by a genetic mutation in the H5 gene, which had never been reported before. It was completely unique. Now, this is not in itself surprising because they're just starting to do these studies. So there may be a lot of cases out there that they haven't seen yet, but it was rare, right? It's definitely a rare thing.
Sure.
But the incredible thing is when our results came back, and it turns out that my wife and I have the exact same genetic mutation, the exact same one
Yeah.
that had never been reported before,
Right.
which means that we have a common ancestor about 500 years ago who had this genetic condition,
Amazing.
passed it through all the generations. We finally met. We fell in love unwittingly, right? That we were eighth cousins or whatever with the same mutation. We met, we fell in love, we had kids, and it resulted in one of them having this heart defect. And it really forces you to consider the really serious and interesting questions of fate, right? And destiny, because I don't know that I would have done anything different. What am I supposed to do? Not marry my wife? Not have these kids? And this is going to sound maybe weird to some of your listeners, maybe not. I don't think I would change anything about his condition, except probably the end, because it was his life and that's who he was. And if he didn't have that, then he would be somebody different, and we loved him for who he was. So this great cosmic coincidence brought this amazing kid into the world who taught us a lot about what it means to live, what it means to be a parent, what it means to heal, what it means to be human. And that's part of the reason that I wrote the book, is to maybe communicate. I mean, it sounds like a very sad topic, right? A child born with a heart defect and dying. But it was such a privilege to see the wonder that his life brought us, and that's what I really wanted to share with folks. And so that's what the book is about.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
Embark on a heartwarming odyssey with Baby Heart's Pressure Gateway to uplifting stories for the CHD community. Introducing the Heart of a Heart Warrior book series, inspiring those born with heart defects and their loved ones. Discover the heart of a mother, the heart of a father, and my brother needs an operation. Books celebrating strength, love, and familial support. Visit babyheartspress.com and be part of our loving community, uplifting hearts one story at a time.
You are listening to Heart with Anna. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. That's anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. Now, back to Heart with Anna.
I think sometimes the medical community doesn't realize how important that family connection is when a child is hospitalized. Your family spent an inordinate amount of time in the hospitals when the dog was young. So, can you share some things with me that your family did to stay connected? I know nowadays, since COVID, things have changed. So now people bring tablets in and they'll Skype or they'll FaceTime. But back when your child was born, and definitely when my kid was born, we didn't have that. It wasn't a thing. So talk to me about how your family stayed connected.
Okay, I have to tell you a little bit about our journey for me to answer that question properly. We had 3 surgeries before the age of 4, one at 5 days, the BTT shunt, one at 5 months, the Glen, and then one just under 4 years, the Fontaine. And each of those were inpatient, but they were relatively brief,
Mhm.
right? It was mainly just for the recovery. When I say brief, he was in the NICU for 49 days, right? So it's not terribly brief,
That is not what I would consider.
but that is also when he was abstract little lump. I mean, he hadn't really opened his eyes. He was just born. He was a newborn.
Well, he was the
He
twin.
was twin. So his twin was like vigorously bawling in the
Yeah.
other room because he was completely healthy. And his brother was in the NICU being watched by these amazing nurses. And one of the things that was really important to us was we didn't want to keep secrets from each other, and certainly not from the kids. And Gilad was 4 when they were born. And we made a promise to him that we would always be honest with him about what was going on as best we could. And in return, we expected him to be honest with us. We would get angry if there was something that he wanted to talk to us about, right? Feel free to do it. But it was really important that he knew what was going on. So we told him everything. And we didn't use euphemisms. One of the things we found, as you'll see in the book, is we learned to trust kids' strength. They have a special strength I think adults lack, which is interesting. But even when we were outside of the hospital, it was really important for us to build a family and keep things normal. Like, we didn't want Nadav to be the sick kid all the time. We wanted him to have a
Right.
normal life. And for us as a family, that was expressed to traveling. For me, to move is to live. I felt an obligation as a parent to show my kids the world, right?
Yeah.
And so we
Absolutely.
would take these crazy road trips. Even after a couple of surgeries, we flew to the West Coast. We flew to San Diego, into Legoland and the zoo, and they met cowboys with flaming lasso. And that's living to me,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
One of the doctors involved in his care said to us once, "Never forget that he's our patient, but he's your son." And I
Yes.
really took that to heart. Really
Yeah.
took it to heart.
I loved it when I read that in the book. I loved it.
Yeah, I thought that was real wisdom. I tried in the book to collect all the pieces of wisdom that we accumulated along the way because some of them are quite profound, and that was one of them.
Yes.
Unfortunately, one of the trips we took did not end well. We decided to go to Australia, which sounds like a pretty random place to go, but my mother's from Australia. We had taken Gilad when he was born. He met his great-grandfather. It's a country that we love. I had the opportunity to fly down because I was going to a conference for virtually nothing. And I said to my wife, let's take the kids. And we thought long and hard about it. And the doctors thought about it because it's a long way for a kid to
Yeah. Absolutely.
travel through.
She did. And he was young.
He was young. He was 4 years old, and he had had this heart defect and 3 surgeries, and it wasn't guaranteed that everything would be okay, but we figured it was worth the risk because that was life, right? And that was something we wanted to share with our kids.
Yes.
So we spent 2 weeks down there. We saw kangaroos. We experienced the country. It was great. And then he didn't look so well, and so we took him to hospital down there, and it turns out he had a clot in his Fontaine, which required emergency surgery, which lasted 14 hours, which is crazy, 7.5 hours on bypass. And suddenly we found ourselves in hospital in a foreign country with foreign doctors, not knowing us. The kids are stranded there in intensive care in critical condition. And that's where it was really like, how do we start adjusting to life where your life does revolve around the hospital?
Right. And thankfully you had family. So
Yeah.
the
Yes.
other children had places to go.
Hmm.
but you still involved your family in the hospitalization. I was really impressed with how you did that. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you did that?
Yeah, I think one of the amazing things when you go to hospitals, you think about doctors a lot, but when you live there, really live there, and we lived in that hospital for 3 months, and then when we got back to the United States, we lived in another hospital in Philadelphia for 6 months.
Yes.
You learn to appreciate the ecosystem of the hospital and all the people who are there. So the nurses are obviously hugely important. In many ways, they're the representatives of humanity and care, right? Like that is their job,
Yeah.
right? Is to make sure you care for the person and not just the patient, right?
Right.
But there are other people there as well. There's therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, there's child life people, there's music therapists. This is the thing I learned to appreciate. They're not just there to entertain the kids, do a little song and dance. They're medical professionals. They are there to provide an important function because it is very easy in the hospital environment to lose your sense of humanity, and preserving that humanity was really important. I'll give you one example of one of the things in Australia where we were able to do that, which never would have happened in the US. When Nadav was not well, he was intubated. And the doctors had told us that he was not doing well and that things were looking very dire. And then the next day, one of the lead doctors said, I'm taking him outside. We're going to take him outside. Intubated, mind you.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? He said, yeah, we're going to take him outside. And it wasn't pity. It was just, this is a human kid who needs to be outside. And the other profound thing that a doctor there said to us was, you just have to be patient because I have to get to know him.
Yes.
And that was
That.
so profound because American doctors are like, they have a swagger. I'm here to heal your kid, right? He understood that the process of healing is something that comes from within. That
Yes.
only Nadav could heal himself, and his job was to give him the best opportunity he could to heal himself. And
Right.
going outside and being human was a part of that. It took about an hour to wheel him 100
Right.
yards
Ran
to
it
the
every
elevator and outside, and they've got a
Oh,
travel ventilator and but it was,
yes.
3 nurses, but it was incredible. It was an incredible gift.
Yes.
And I think it was hugely important in his care. And when we
Mhm.
got back to the States, being outside was something that was hugely important to us. So we started exploring every inch of the hospital. I mentioned people who are in the hospital who are hugely important. Security guards are super
Yes.
important. You have to get to know the security guards. And you can tell a lot about the hospital from the security guards too, because they take on the personality of the place.
Yeah.
And the people in Philadelphia were great. They would literally open doors for us so we could go explore. So we started sneaking him off campus. We broke all the rules. We took him out in the car for a drive around the city, like all these
I
things.
couldn't believe you did that.
God,
Oh my gosh. And the security wasn't ready after you. Thanks.
yeah, I guess that was a possibility, but it was super important for his care as a person and not just a patient. And I think that's one of the things we learned in hospitals was you don't stop being a person when you're in there, even though some people may treat you that way. Sometimes you have to advocate for, hey, there's some things that are important that you need to feel human.
Right. I loved it. You painted such a vivid picture with your words. You really did such a great job with your book to help us feel like we were right there with you, trying to negotiate getting that bed out. Just couldn't believe that they did that. It was
It was really hard work. It was really emotionally draining. It was not sunshine and rainbows. Every day was a battle.
yeah.
We're lucky to have amazing people taking care of him, but even that, it becomes your all-consuming
But
focus.
what I loved was that the other children came to be outside with Nadav, and
Yes.
Nadav could watch his brothers play. And I'm sure that brought a smile to his face. And I'm sure it made him feel more connected to the family because he
Mhm.
had to have felt so isolated. And you guys found really creative ways to bring that sense of family into the hospital.
And not easy for his brothers, obviously, to have their brother in hospital. I think one of the problems that we always feared was that their imaginations would run away with them and they would imagine all these terrible things. And for us, it was always better to see it than to imagine it. But that takes a toll too to see it. It really does. But they were incredible. I mean, I remember when he was back home in New York, they would play doctor. They'd get all the medical supplies and they'd put him on the bed and he would be the patient and he was used to being the patient. But
Right.
they could be the doctors, but they did innovative techniques. They would like kind of whack him on the leg whenever, like and- but they got to participate in it. And I think although that is a difficult thing even for an adult to do, to be witness to it,
Yeah.
I think not being part of it, which happened at times, to be honest with you,
But you couldn't let them see
is
it.
really hard. Yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't let them see everything. I remember we had a 3-year-old son when our second child was born, and I wondered how this was going to affect Joey because we had to go to a different town. He had never been to daycare. I was a stay-at-home mom. And I remember saying to Frank, we need to take pictures. You need to take some pictures to Joey. Joey needs to know that we're taking care of his sibling and that everything's going to be okay, or that if it's not okay, that we did everything that we could. But I didn't want him to see the baby intubated. I was
Hmm.
afraid that would be too traumatic for
Hmm.
a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
No, we were lucky. We were able to take pictures before and after the intubation, and Frank was able to go home and talk to Joey and show him the nurses and doctors were on them because we said, "Can we take pictures of you so that our son can see?" Because I didn't want a 3-year-old up there in the PICU. He was in the pediatric intensive cardiac unit. They did not want him to come up there until he was in the step down unit because 3-year-olds and germs are pretty synonymous.
Yeah. Yeah, we had that when I was in the NICU. Gilad was 4, he came to visit. He would sing to him. We thought that was important. But
Yes.
even when they were much older, and I think you're right, it is a judgment call sometimes, especially with very young kids, about what they can see and what they can't. But adults recoil from this stuff. Even when you're just walking along the street, they recoil. When Nadav came home, he was on oxygen. His oxygen levels were low. And he had a nasal cannula. He also had an NG tube. People would look at that and that instant of like, ooh, ugh, right?
Yeah.
But he went to kindergarten, which is a remarkable part of the story as well. His teacher was so wise. She said, let me explain to the class what's happening before he shows up. And she explained all the things that they could expect. So the nasal cannula, she said, it's there to give him oxygen, right? He needs extra oxygen. It gives him oxygen. Well, adults, they see a nasal cannula and it's like he's on his deathbed. Kids look at the nasal cannula. Once you've explained it to
Yeah.
them that he needs oxygen, they're like, well, that's a good thing.
Right.
It gives him oxygen. Great. And
Yeah.
then they just look right past it.
Mm.
And that is something I think adults can learn from. That's a pretty
Oh, absolutely. I remember having another guest on my program some years back, and she had a child who was a few years older. And like you're saying, the child had to be on oxygen. And her little one said, well, let's call this. And I can't remember what name they gave it, but they named the
Mhm.
oxygen concentrator. And I thought, yes, it. Yeah, we have to bring whatever the name, Steve, with us wherever we go. So,
That's right. Well, there's all these tricks you do as a parent. Like I took him to a firehouse because I wanted him to see that the firefighters, these big burly guys, they needed oxygen too. They had their own tanks. So I'm like, okay, here's your tank. Here's their tanks. They're big dudes. They're strong. They need oxygen too. That's fine. But he didn't need any of that. He was such a wise soul. I haven't really told you much about him. He had this curly blonde hair. He was a really old soul. He was named after his great grandfather, who had been a partisan in the woods of Poland, blowing up Nazi tanks for 4 years, who survived that and 8 more surgeries. We wanted to give Nadav that, and he sort of inherited that wisdom. But he would be a participant in his medical care. This is a kid who, when he was 5, stuck in the hospital with a cloudy lung that wouldn't clear, insisted on being on rounds. And they would round every day and they would show him the x-ray, again, not in a condescending way. And he'd sit there and ponder it for a few minutes. He'd absorb it. And you don't quite know what's going on in a 5-year-old's head, but I think he understood a lot of what was going on. And often doctors who didn't know him were very condescending to him. He had to learn how to walk again. He had these things called knee immobilizers they put on your legs when you learn to walk again because his muscles had atrophied. And one of these new doctors came up to him and said, have you worn your leg huggies today? And he looks her right in the eye and he says, knee immobilizers.
literally, and the doctor wasn't meaning to be disrespectful, but that just goes to show how brilliant our kids could be.
Yes.
And I know that when my baby was in the hospital as a 2-month-old infant, that we were looking at my baby, and one of the nurses said to me, that baby is a wise soul.
Mm.
And I thought, you are so right. And my child, as she was growing up, also came up with stuff sometimes that made me think, you're way too wise for your years. And that story reminded me of that experience, that same experience. I felt such a kinship with you when I was reading the book. There were so many different similarities like that. You did such a good job of portraying what it's like to raise a child with a chronic illness, but especially with a critical congenital heart defect.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, this is why the parent doctor partnership is so important because you both see different sides of the child, and it's only by seeing the whole picture that you can really make informed decisions. And even then, things can go wrong. But we had an instinct, a medical instinct about what things were right for him and what weren't that doctors could not see because we just spent different time with him. And doctors saw a side of him that we didn't see. I remember the surgery in Australia, we met with a surgeon afterwards who had spent 14 hours inside him, like literally. And I said, "Can you tell anything about him from operating on him?" And she said, "I can tell he's a tough cookie." She was like, "The scarring in there, that was some pretty impressive stuff." And I didn't quite know what she was talking about because I didn't see it, but she knew by touching and feeling what his literal body was like, the toughness that ran through him. And she was completely right. Completely right.
Heart to Heart with Anna is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a non-profit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to uplift, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at www.congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, the hospitals that treat children with CHD, summer camps for CHD survivors, and much, much more.
In your book, there are so many different levels. It's like an onion. I just kept peeling back more and more layers. And I was like, yes, he gets it. I've read some other books written by heart parents, and they didn't touch me the same way that your book touched me because I felt like some of them were dealing with so much trauma that they blew things out of proportion, or they just would very lightly touch something. When as someone who has lived that, I knew there was so much more to the story, but I don't know if they were afraid of freaking people out or they hadn't really dealt with it themselves. I don't know, but it's like they couldn't really handle that. You really tackled everything head on. It's like you really weren't afraid to deal with a lot of the tough topics.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks. It's hard for me to weigh in on other people's experience, but I didn't read any of the other books until I finished mine because I didn't want to be influenced by it.
okay.
And now I have a whole library of these books that I've read. And
Okay.
you're right, they're very diverse and they're all idiosyncratic and unique to the person who wrote them. That's for sure.
Sure.
I needed to write this thing. I needed to get it down on paper, mainly for his brothers, as I say in the introduction, but also that in the hopes it would help people and doctors who are caring for kids like us. So that means a lot to hear you say that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Well, I want you to tell my listeners more about your book, More Than We Expected 5 Years with a Remarkable Child. And first of all, I want you to tell us where can we get it? Because now that everybody's heard all these amazing stories, I know they're going to want to read more because, friends, we have just barely touched on what you can read in this book. So where can we find your
The book is available on Amazon and most major online retailers. If you want to know specifically where to get it, the best way to go is the book's website, which is morethan-a-memoir.com. I know that's different than the book's title. The book is More Than We Expected. The website is More Than a Memoir. I couldn't get the domain. It's caused all sorts of confusion, but that is the best way to find the book. You can also go to your local bookstore and they'll order it for you. You can go to your local library and ask them to order a copy.
do all of that, friends, because you know what? Your library needs to have a copy of this book. So please go ask your librarian for it and go ahead and order a copy because you're going to want a copy in your library. Friends, if you're on your exercise bike or you're driving to work, don't worry about getting a piece of paper and a pen. I will have the links in the show notes. So now tell us a little bit more about the book. We already know why you wrote it, thanks to the New York Times article that you wrote. I have a feeling there was more to it than that.
Yeah. The thing the article that I wrote for the Times taught me is that our experience touched other people. The article was about a road trip we took after he died. We went around the country because we needed to get away. We needed to be distracted by the world. But what we found is it was just a really great way to cope with a loss. And other people had had that experience. And in response to the article, they wrote these comments, which were really touching and meaningful. So that taught me that other people could benefit from hearing our story, perhaps. But I also needed to write. I didn't want the story to evaporate, but I needed to get it out of my brain. I sat down every day and I wrote 1,000 words about a particular topic, just as essays. So I wrote once about hearts, I wrote about doctors, I wrote about parenting, I wrote about parking, I wrote about food. Parking is super important. My editor, all the stuff about parking is taken out of the book. But parking is super important.
Yeah, there's so much to park in, especially when you're in a hospital that requires you to pay for parking every day. And
Maybe this will be the long-awaited sequel to More Than We Expected. Parking story. It's from a parent on the front lines. But anyway, I wrote these essays because I need to get them out of my brain and onto paper. And then I thought maybe this is something people would want to read. But more than that, I really wanted to have this available for his brothers.
Yes.
I wanted them to understand what we had been through from the father's perspective. And I don't know if they're quite ready for it even now. But when they're old enough to really appreciate that, hopefully it'll have some memories of their brother in there, but it will also have my perspective on it, and hopefully that will help them. So that was one reason. And then I really think my hope is that it helps people caring for children like our son,
Yeah.
whether they're alive or not. And there's a big gulf between parents whose kids are alive and parents whose kids aren't. I know that. But my hope is that it touches parents in both situations, and then also the people caring for kids like Nadav, doctors, nurses, all the people, even security guards, that they can understand maybe a little better about what it means to take care of patients from a human perspective and not just a
Yeah.
medical perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think there's this big a gulf between the parents of children who are living with CHD and the ones who have passed. In my almost 30 years of being part of this community, as soon as you have a child with a heart defect, you're part of a big community. And what I have seen happens is when a child passes, a lot of the bereaved parents don't feel like they can still be part of that community because they're afraid that their story is every parent's worst nightmare.
that's right.
Therefore, they feel like they have to exclude themselves from being part of the NCHD world. But I do have some friends who haven't done that and who have stayed part of the community because they realize that they do have stories like you do, some bits of wisdom that they can share with the CHD community, and they continue to be advocates. I will admit it's far fewer people who stay involved, and some of them have to leave and then come back. And that's fine because the same thing is true with our parents is that sometimes, especially when you're dealing with that initial diagnosis, you can't get enough information. And then all of a sudden you have too much information and you have to take a step back, or life happens. And we do what you talked about, which is we're raising our kid and we're not letting the CHD be the focal point anymore, but then something will happen and it'll bring people back. So I've seen this ebb and flow with parents who have children with CHD and even with children with CHD who have passed. So I hope you won't exclude yourself from the CHD community because I feel like you still have a lot to offer.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think a couple of things. First of all, grief is a very lonely thing. Everybody grieves in their own way, and there's huge gulfs. My wife and I went through exactly the same thing, and we grieve completely differently.
Right.
Within the grief community, there's huge chasms between people who have had the same experience. I remember being in a parent support group with other parents who had lost kids. And we were the only parents who knew when he was born that there was a possibility that he might die. Everybody else had lost a child suddenly. And I looked at them thinking, I cannot imagine what that's like. That to me is, I can't imagine it. But they looked at me the same way. They were like,
Right.
I can't imagine knowing that when your son's born that you might lose him. So the grass is always browner, I guess. The other thing is, one of the nice things about having written this book that I hadn't expected when I wrote it. Remember earlier in the conversation, I alluded to the fact that once your child dies, suddenly this part of your identity is ripped out.
Yes.
Is it has given me permission to reconnect. Okay,
Yeah.
obviously, I want to sell books. You should all buy the books. But just the fact that I get to have this conversation with you, Anna, and your listeners is a gift for me,
Right.
right? Because it allows me to re-immerse myself in a land that I don't quite belong to. I know I appreciate your point, but I don't quite belong to anymore. My secret talent, put an NG tube in a sleeping baby in the middle of the night without them waking up. That is completely useless to me now. There's no reason for me to bring that up.
That's
Right?
yeah.
And now I can talk about it. The third thing I'll say on this point is I met a wonderful woman, Lee Camping Carter, who was born with the same condition.
I know.
Yeah. Born with the same condition as Nadav. She had the same 3 surgeries, and she lived. And I met her. She wrote this article in the Wall Street Journal. I reached out. I worked at the New York Times. We had a reason to meet. And I sat down with her, and we looked at each other, and she's like, "Well, why do you want to talk to me? I lived." And I was sort of like, "Why do you want to talk to me? Because am I not the ghost of what could have been?" And we had this magnificent conversation.
She's
And
a
I had never dreamed that, first of all, there was a community of adult CHD people who had survived these surgeries. They were always abstractions to me. To meet somebody who had actually done it was kind of mind blowing.
yeah.
But it felt like the most comfortable thing in the world. And so you're right, these preconceptions and how you visualize yourself when this trauma happens is often far from reality. And I think that's one of the gratifying things since I published the book is learning that there are other people with other experiences and being able to communicate with them.
And that you still belong. You and Tolly, the children, you're all still part of our community. And I know it's probably hard to think about it because that's what robbed you of seeing your child grow up. But this is still a really loving community. And we're doing amazing things. We are educating one another. We're inspiring one another. We're pushing the world beyond to find solutions so that we don't have to lose children like Nadav in the future. And part of the way that we do that is through our advocacy. And this book is an attribution to the knowledge that is being gained. You shared some amazing knowledge in your book, and it's another means for our communities to say, hey, look at this. This is another newsworthy item. We exist. Pay attention. Why are you spending more money on childhood cancer than you are on CHDs?
Mm.
Let's start putting more money behind this so that we can eradicate congenital heart defects. I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but it will definitely never happen if we're not talking about it. So the fact that you wrote the book and that you're on the podcast talking about it is part of our advocacy effort. So thank you for doing that. And to that end, you have been on a lot of podcasts. I've really been impressed. I listened to your episode with Dr. Robert Pass, who is amazing. He's been on my program before too. I just love him. And your interview with him was absolutely excellent. But I'm wondering if there have been some specific topics or questions that nobody has asked you yet that you wish somebody would have asked you.
I don't know. I think I put it all in the book. And actually, Anna, one of the cool things about writing a book is you get to see your experience through other people's eyes, and they often notice things that you hadn't noticed. So maybe this is a bleak way of answering your question, but there are parts of the book that I just wanted to rush through when I was writing it. I was like, there is no way this is interesting to anybody. Who wants to be stuck in the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia with us for 6 months, right? Who wants that? And actually, one of the earliest pieces of feedback from a parents group was that was the most fascinating thing for them is like, how do you live in a hospital for 6 months? And I had never dreamed that that was the case. This is why I encourage your readers to reach out. If they go to the website, they can contact me, and hearing what touched them about the book or things that provoke thoughts about it is also gratifying, because there are things that I hadn't realized were interesting that actually turned out to be quite interesting.
I love it. I love it. Well, since you've been on our brother podcast, which is Brie, but still me, I had the opportunity to hear you speak with Michael Lieben. But I have spent this entire time talking to you, and I have never said how sorry I am for Nadav's passing. And I didn't want to conduct this entire interview without letting you know that. Now I'm going to start crying. Sorry. This is what's so hard about what I do. So your story really did affect me, and how sad it is that his life here on earth was so short. So before I end, I would love for you to share one special memory that you have of Nadav, something that all of us can hold on to so that we can remember your son.
Yeah. You read the book, so you got to know him, and that's great. He would never had a chance to meet you otherwise. So that's great. I mentioned he had curly blonde hair. I didn't mention that he was an old wise soul. He was super smart. And he loved to dance. Danced at his cousin's bat mitzvah, which is a really special moment. We went to a baseball game in North Carolina in the sweltering heat. And while his brother complained about the popcorn not tasting like the popcorn we had at home, he stood there in the aisle and he just rocked back and forth and did his own little jig while they were playing. So that's one thing. But it's hard to encapsulate any life into one moment. And hopefully I've done the job of the book of helping you get to know him and your listeners get to know him too, because he was a remarkable child. And he was lucky to travel around the world and meet all sorts of interesting people, maybe not under the best of circumstances, but he was lucky to do that. And the people who met him realize how lucky they are. And the fact that new people can meet him now as well means more than you can.
Yes. Well, I do feel like I know your family, and I really enjoyed reading the book. Friends, please buy this book, share it with everyone. Ask the librarian to buy it so more people can read it as well. More than we expected. The book was more than I expected, to be honest with you. It touched me in ways I didn't expect it to. So thank you so much, James, for coming on the program today and sharing your stories and your experiences with us.
Thanks, Anna. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Heart to Heart with Anna. Don't forget to check out James Robinson's book, More Than We Expected. 5 Years with a Remarkable Child wherever you buy books, or check it out on his website, morethan-a-memoir.com. The book touched me deeply, and I'm sure it will touch you too. Until next week, my friends, remember, you are not alone.
Thank you again for joining us this week. We hope you have become inspired and empowered to become an advocate for the congenital heart community. Heart to Heart with Anna with your host, Anna Jaworski, can be heard at any time wherever you get your podcasts. A new episode is released every Tuesday from noon Eastern Time.